everyone. Welcome to the new episode of the Life That Said Yes Conversations. And today my guest is Linda Hartley, a somatic movement therapist and educator, transpersonal psychotherapist, teacher of the discipline of authentic movement, a trainer and a writer, and the founding director of the Institute for Integrative Bodywork and Movement Therapy. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you for this wonderful invitation. Good to be here.
So I read on your website that you live in England near the Norfolk coast. And as you say, in a village nestled between water meadows, ancient woodlands, and farmland. Can you tell me a little bit about the nature out there around you?
Well, I think nature has always inspired me. My very first memory was of nature, trees. When I first moved here, it was about 18 years ago now, to this particular part. I've almost always lived in England and Scotland a little bit. So when I first moved here, it was the coast, the sea, that really called me. I grew up by the sea further north in the country, and I'd always wanted to go back. And I just wanted to be walking on the beach every day. It was quite hard to get any work done. I wanted to be out there. And I had this need to be as near to the water's edge. There was something about walking along the water's edge. There's walks on the cliffs and on the marshes, which are lovely too, but I just had this real need to be on the boundary. Something about that boundary land between the vast ocean space and the solid structures of the land. So I needed to place myself in that kind of boundary, intermediate, liminal space, if you like. So that's always inspired me. And I would say healed. It's been very healing. And now, where I live now, I'm closer to some wonderful woods and more rural landscape than when I first moved up here. So I spend more time with trees these days and become my friends. My studio in my garden is surrounded by very particular trees that become like my witness circle. So they inspire me in different ways, the nature in all sorts of ways. It's where I find my ground. It's where I return when I need to, I think, just really reconnect with myself.
What you just said reminds me of my own personal relationship to nature, where initially there was only this connection with the sea. And I grew up in a family that wasn't really connected with nature nor nurtured this feeling. But every year when we went to the seaside, I felt this deep connection to the sea, and just looking at it for hours and having this sense of awe and the wilderness, the mystery of it. And then later on, I discovered this same connection with the mountain and the forest. But it was a process as I was getting more attuned to myself that I started noticing nature around us. And there's this nice quote of yours that I read. I would like to read it. You say, when we are deeply connected to our own embodied being, we naturally come into deepened reconnection with the earth body, out of which we have evolved and upon which we are totally dependent for life. So you talk about this ability to perceive nature more and hear the messages from the earth and the earth's voice. And you mentioned that you have this relationship with the trees. Can you speak a little bit about that, our ability to hear the nature?
Well, I think first in my experience, I need to slow down and stop. And I think that's where somatic work can really be helpful. Somatic work teaches us, prepares us to listen. And first we listen inwardly, but if we expand our listening, and by listening, of course, it's not just the ears, it's proprioception, listening into the body, but also listening through our hearing, through our seeing, through all the different ways, touch. So listening in somatic work, we generally intend to mean all of our senses being open, paying attention. So there's usually some kind of stopping or slowing down that enables us, because look at the pace of nature. Look at how long it takes a tree to grow. It doesn't do it so quickly. So slowing down to nature's pace a little bit. And there's just something about the attention and the intention. So the attention, opening our senses, and then the intention perhaps to see what we receive when we do that. Is there a feeling? Is there an energy? Is there a message? And this is where we humans anthropomorphize, that wonderful word. We translate what comes to us from nature into our own language so that we can make meaning, make it useful in some way, have some clearer connection. But sometimes it's just being there and feeling into, what is the feeling of this place? What do I sense and feel when I stop and pay attention to this particular place, this particular tree, this particular flower, this bird that comes and sits on my breakfast table? And, that initial experience I think many of us had at the beginning of the pandemic, where we had to stay at home. And for many, not everyone, of course, but for many of us, it was a slowing down and a stopping. And my experience was definitely nature coming closer, the birds and the butterflies coming closer and sitting with me as I stopped. So that feels really important. And then, depending on where we are in our life and what our interest is, that might generate some interest for activity of some sort, whether it's environmental activism or working in our garden or, whatever. Doing something that supports the wildlife, whatever it might be. But I think for me, the first step is that we slow down and stop and open our attention to sensing and feeling, and then we might translate that into a message, into words or action. We might not. We might just sit there or stand there or walk and be with that. I know walking on the beach and falling into the rhythm of the waves. I find that so healing. That's just something about living at the coast where I read an article, someone in the Peter Levine School of Somatic Experience, I think it was, writing an article about, someone had asked, well, what do you do if you've suffered trauma and you don't have a therapist nearby? And they said, the best thing is walking on the beach or walking in the woods, but walking on the beach, walking by the sea, that rhythm of the waves that can, unless it's a really stormy day. I was there on Sunday and it was wild, but on a generally the rhythm of the sea is calming for our autonomic nervous system, helps us to settle towards a more parasympathetic state, which can be resourcing for any trauma or emotional states we're in. So sometimes it's just as the simple being with and opening to and listening, paying attention.
Yeah, beautiful. when we realize we have so many help coming from nature.
Yeah.
That was incredible to find out for me how, for example, when I just like that walking in the beach or witnessing a lake with a smooth surface and the calm water, how it can dissolve my state of agitation.
Mhm.
Or approaching a tree and just consciously asking for help.
Yeah.
And some sort of energetic transfer starts happening. And it's not like I'm throwing my negativity into the tree. It's more like a cycle
Mhm.
that happens, but it's alive and it's conscious. And also the messages that you've mentioned. Many times I receive the message that I translate into words, but I have a feeling that they came from another living
Yes.
entity and not myself.
Yes, it does feel that way. At the back of my studio, there's an oak tree. And in my authentic movement practice, I found I was again and again drawn to that part of the space. And it would feel often like a support. It felt very strong. It feels, I'm in a different phase at the moment, but it would feel very strong and upright, and I could rest into it. It's just a meter or so away from the back wall of the studio. So I could feel its presence in the studio. And when the students were here with me, I would often see them being drawn to that place, and somehow significant moments or emotions could come up, and somehow be
Mhm.
supported in that space. So very mysterious, but it definitely, how eyes closed, moving in an open space, again and again being drawn to this particular place where the tree stands.
Right.
And it branches over the skylight windows, and often I'd open my eyes and there'd be a bird looking down at me. It would seem to be looking down at me. My perception.
Mhm.
Oh, my witness up there in the tree. So I love that this has become important to me over the last few years. This kind of intimate connection with my immediate environment. We can feel overwhelmed when we think about what the global, what the earth needs. How can my little piece of action or intention make a change? But I think each of us doing what we can, paying attention, taking action if we can, where we can, in our immediate environment. I trust that makes some difference to the bigger scale of the need in the world.
Right.
Or at least support us to stay present to that need.
Definitely. I mean, just if we look at things from this holistic point of view that everything is connected to everything, then I guess the change in our immediate environment or the space that we hold in some way supports the whole.
Yes, I do feel that. And the change, coming back to somatic work, the little changes we can make towards our own health and well-being. I feel we need to keep doing that,
Yeah.
even when it feels like the pull to be doing something bigger out in the world is strong. I feel those little actions towards healing that we can do for ourselves, just dedicate that towards the whole that we're part of. So each one of us working towards our own health and well-being. We never get there, but we keep working towards it. We
Right.
never get there in a world that's not well, but it's like, our little drop in the ocean matters. Each of us, I feel that. But yeah, as you say, we're part of this whole, and so what we do matters. And sometimes, we're all told to stay at home. What could we do but pay attention to our own well-being in that time? For many of us, that that was necessary. So I think that period really has been changing the collective understanding of collective healing, what that is. Of course, there's a need for going out and being active and engaging. And this other aspect, which is more, more intimate, personal, individual, or in small groups. And I work with these small groups in my studio at the moment with authentic movement primarily these days. And that, so I just keep internally dedicating that to the well-being of the wider collective. We're a small collective, but we're practicing what I hope has a rippling out in some way.
Right. Can you speak a little bit about authentic movement? Give a short introduction to it. And I was interesting, I saw on the website that you always write the discipline of authentic movement.
Yes. I mean, the authentic movement, which originated with Mary Stocks Whitehouse in the States in the 1950s, I think, 50s and 60s, she was developing and teaching this practice that came to be known. She talked about active imagination and movement from a Jungian perspective and moving authentically, but it came to be known as authentic movement with capital letters. And Janet Adler, one of her principal students, not the only one of her principal students, but Janet, I think, more than anybody, absolutely dedicated her life to authentic movement. This is what she did. Others were perhaps applying it in dance movement psychotherapy and Jungian analysis and other fields of practice. Janet really focused on this, and the discipline is what she called, what she developed. So because she was my primary teacher, I study the discipline of authentic movement with Janet. But there are many other people teaching broader approaches to authentic movement. But Janet's approach is quite specific, very detailed, very in-depth. And her approach was towards mystical, and she uses the word mystical practice or spiritual practice, we might say, sacred practice. But these are the ways that she came to speak about her work as a mystical practice. So the discipline, of course, it includes all the levels of personal healing, but it embraces the possibility that every moment where we're working towards our personal healing can also be a moment of opening into a mystical experience, and that the personal journey is a potential portal into something wider, into the transpersonal. So that was very much essential to the work she developed. And more as we practice this, we see that the personal and the transpersonal are actually not separate. Right. They actually meet, integrate, they're inherently connected. But we endeavor not to jump over this phrase in transpersonal psychology of spiritual bypass. We try not to do the spiritual bypass where we jump over our personal wounds and traumas to come into some more rarefied mystical place. So we go through the personal material as it's embodied, as it arises through our embodied movement practice. And I think in the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, when I was growing up and then developing my practice, and there were lots of Eastern traditions coming to the West, and there was lots of spiritual bypassing going on. We thought if we just sat on our meditation cushions for long enough, we could solve all our problems. And many of us couldn't, because we had trauma that needed to be addressed in a more personal way. Janet's way of evolving the discipline really, I feel, enables us to embrace both. And she talks, she writes and used to talk about the interplay between gestures that might unfold as we're working through, maybe, for example, a childhood trauma. And we're working through that in our movement practice over time, because it takes time. And then one day, enough of that has been processed, the energy is released, and that same gesture opens out into a transpersonal experience. We open out we widen out. You began or speaking earlier about widening out. We widen out into something that goes beyond our personal self. So that relationship between the personal trauma or wounding and the spiritual or mystical, transpersonal level of experience is what we are invited to explore in the discipline. And because Janet's interest became more and more, and in her years of development, towards the mystical, the practices that she developed particularly invite that. And my experience in the way that I work with my groups, I really keep emphasizing that we go through the personal, because I don't want people to feel, this spiritual bypassing. I don't want them to feel, oh, now I'm in some kind of rarefied place. It's not about that. So I want them to keep grounding in their embodied personal experience. But the practices that Janet developed in the discipline invite us, when we're ready, to open out. I think that when we're ready. And I've heard people saying, like, oh, I just realized I don't need to keep going back into that story. I actually know it very well. I've heard people in the studio getting to that point in this moment, not forever, but in this movement session right now. I can just let the story go and focus on just what's arising for me in this moment. What am I sensing, feeling, maybe imagining? There might be energetic, what Janet called energetic phenomena, experiences of energy moving through the body, moving around, moving in the space. Our spatial awareness might be changing. So when we're ready to let go of the story of our personal journey here, and that's different for everyone, then we can just say, well, what's here right now? And that's where it potentially becomes a portal, an opening into the transpersonal.
Right. Yes, and then this transpersonal also gives us a wider view of the situation and the lesson behind it, and the pathway of the soul.
Absolutely, yeah. And I will say the other way, what I feel is that I don't think Janet Adler wrote about this so much, but my feeling is that sometimes we need to be in that spiritual place for a while in order to help us to hold the trauma until we're ready to deal with the trauma. So I think it also works that way. So that gesture, that wonderful gesture that we discover in our movement practice, and oh, now I'm above it all, now I'm fine and I'm free. But it's a little bit of a spiritual bypass, but it can hold us until we're ready. It can be a resource until we're ready to come back into our body and our wounded places. So there can be, I feel, a two-way process there.
Right. And I feel it's also a way for us to become more conscious of who we really are and what we really are, and that we are much more wide.
Yes.
and strong and powerful and much more wide and complex than just this personality here with the particular trauma.
Yes, and how our mind, our ego mind, can keep us narrowed. I've got to hold
Yes.
on to this till I can sort it out. But yes, sometimes being released from that, even just for a moment, into this wider space
Yeah.
can be incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
That wider perspective. And I feel that collectively too, sometimes to be able to see what our global community is going through in these difficult days from a wider perspective. I mean, that's a pretty wide perspective, but not from the perspective of conflict and crises and all of that. But, what might be the wider process
Yeah.
that's happening for us collectively in a similar way to the personal.
Mm. My only experience with authentic movement is during BMC courses. We usually have a session of authentic movement as some sort of integration. And me being the witness, but also witnessing the whole space with a lot of people inside it, it often gives me this feeling of beauty and sadness at the same time. Because I see all of us carry these individual stories and pains, and it can be seen very easily in the context of authentic movement. But then again, like you said, when I'm moving, I could see the difference when I'm locked in my own story, in my own pain, let's say, how this projects through my movement, through the emotions that are stirring, but also then this wonderful, I would say, mystical experience, as if more of myself is entering myself, and these gestures come out, and these beautiful spirals, and I can feel the central axis, and really feel like the connection of the heaven and earth, or those dervish dances, which takes me out of my narrow.
Beautiful. Yes. And we have to know both, haven't we?
Exactly.
And you say the beauty and the sadness. And I feel that's absolutely what we're needing to learn at the moment, how to hold both, how to be present. There's a lot of suffering in us and in the world. But there's a lot of beauty around us too. I mean, I live in this beautiful place now. I hadn't always lived in such a beautiful environment, but I do now. And, I'm still witnessing all the suffering that goes on in the world, experiencing it myself and my students at times, but holding both, holding the
Yeah.
beauty enables us to be with the sadness. I think that's another way of putting what you're saying, when we can open out to that mystical experience, we can hold the other, the personal, the sadness, the suffering, or
Yeah.
in a bigger space.
And then the beauty of the ordinary also comes out more. Once we had this big experience, then we look at ordinary things in a different way.
Yes.
I feel it's very important, this combination of both polarities, and also this combination of personal and transpersonal. I feel many people I meet on my journey who get too pulled by the negative, and then they can only see the negative. Or the people looking for healing, but somehow become trapped in this word trauma and their own personal story. And then everything just revolves around that. So how to find the balance?
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe it's inevitable that for a while we have to focus on that because there's such an energy in it until we can find ways to work through that. I think as you're speaking about that, I'm thinking in my own experience, it's like when I get identified with that traumatized part of myself, of my history, and in a period of life, it was so big I couldn't see anything else. Now it might pop up and I can see it, but I can much more easily embrace in that wider embrace that you're talking about. It might still be there. But it's like in a little corner. It's not the whole. I don't experience the whole. And I think we maybe all, or many of us, go through that for a period of time where we need to be focusing focusing on healing something difficult until we can really step outside and see, oh, that's a part of my experience. It's not all of my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't go away, but it can transform. It can become less dominant. Becomes less identified with it.
Yeah. So in 1990, you wrote a book called Servants of the Sacred Dream.
Yeah.
What is the sacred dream?
The Servants of the Sacred Dream is one interpretation of the word therapeutae, who were the attendants of the gods in the ancient Greek healing rituals, and people would go to the temple. So the therapeutae, basically they were there to create a held space for the people seeking healing to go in, to go to sleep, to have their dreams. So they would make them comfortable, they would feed them, make sure everything was okay. They weren't doing the healing, they were holding the space. So that phrase I love, servants of the sacred dream. That this is task, perhaps challenge, I don't know. But that's where it comes from the ancient Greek, the Delphic oracle, I think. Sorry, my memory goes back a few decades now. I think it was the Delphic oracle, but ancient Greek rituals for healing. And I love that idea that they're servants, they're attendants. They're not doing the healing. The healing is going to come through the dream, or through our movement practice, or through our inner work, whatever that might be. The healing is going to come through the dream, but a safe space needs to be held for that to take place. So when we're a practitioner with a client, or when we're a witness holding a space for movers, I feel we're kind of in that role. We're not the expert. Janet had this lovely phrase, the mover is the expert of their own experience. As the witness, I'm not the expert. I'm the one that's there, present, holding the space so that it's hopefully safe enough for them to do the work they need to do.
That's beautiful. And this word servant also denotes that we are not in control, that we are not masters, but that we actually bow down to a force that somehow knows.
A force that knows, what we don't yet know.
Exactly. So there's this element of humbleness also.
Yeah.
And the idea of creating a nurturing space, which is also, I feel, connected. I don't know if you address it in that book, but with this balancing of polarities, feminine and masculine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that whole book is about an addressing. In the time when I was writing, beginning in 1990, we were still very much in a wave of feminism, and how can I put this? There was a wave, not the social political wave, but a wave of really coming from a lot of Jungian women writers in particular, but this wave of really trying to redress the balance in our inner world as well as the outer world of the feminine within each of us. And as our culture has often oppressed the more feminine qualities, and I use that archetypally, not gender-wise, then internally we often have as well. So the whole book was really about a rebalancing, or looking at the re-empowerment of the feminine within us and in the world, so that there can be more of a balance. And it's the feminine in men as much as the feminine in women. But I do look in that book primarily from a woman's perspective, but it's meant to speak to the feminine in all of us. And I think since that time, I was writing in the 1990s, but obviously that movement of consciousness has an earlier history. And Mary Stotts Whitehouse and Janet Adler and Bonnie and all of those people, I consider part of that. There's been a lot of change. Now there is much more. It's not perfect. There's still a long way to go, and in some parts of the world, an enormously long way to go. But there is much more move in the direction of balancing. I don't even want to say equality, because that brings up all sorts of questions about social, political issues, which are really important. But the balancing, where the qualities of each can come into relationship. So I speak in that book about the marriage of the masculine and the feminine.
It's a very alchemical concept.
Yes, exactly.
The marriage and the union of masculine and feminine, and again takes us to a transpersonal.
It really does, yes.
Sacred experience.
One of the myths I look at in that book is the myth of Inanna, which is an ancient Sumerian myth that goes back to a pre-patriarchal time. But when the patriarchy was beginning to become powerful. So to me, that was a really interesting time in relation to our time, where I don't think we're going back into a matriarchal time, but hopefully into a more balanced, hopefully into the marriage of masculine and feminine. But before patriarchy, there was matriarchy, and the goddess was really powerful. So it's a story, a myth about the goddess going to the underworld and reclaiming herself, basically. So it can be read psychologically, it can be read culturally and archetypally, and in many levels culturally. So yeah, the journey to the underworld, which is what we were talking about in a different context, in context of authentic movement, the journey to the underworld of our wounding and our trauma, to meet with ourself, so that we can come through that empowered with a wider perspective, also more rooted in an embodied spirituality. The patriarchal gods in that story, most of them are very, airy, and they don't want to help her. They don't want to meddle with the underworld.
Right.
I think we see a lot of that in the world, don't we? They rather fight it out in the underworld than go into the underworld and find out actually what's the trauma behind their behavior in the outer world. Gosh, if those politicians could have some good trauma therapy, we'd be in a different world now.
Definitely.
If they would. They won't.
Definitely. Some say it should be a prerequisite to come into office.
It really, really should. And the Inanna story is so wonderful, because in the next turning of the wheel, she sends Dumuzi, who was her husband consort, it's his turn to go down. So I think it has a message for the future as well. The humbling of and the re-embodying of the masculine in us, to reconnect, to heal those wounds of the masculine. And so when you spoke a few moments ago about people who seem to become really totally absorbed in the negativity and the trauma. I think when we're in that underworld journey, there isn't anything else.
Right.
Just in there. We just need help. We need holding. We need support until we come. Because it's an archetypal journey.
Yeah.
Most of us go through in some way or other. Perhaps there are some who don't. I don't know. But many, many people go through this in some way and to some degree. But I think when we're in there, we can't see the light.
Right.
In the underworld. We're underground.
Mm-hmm.
And to understand that, so it's like when movers go into the authentic movement circle and close their eyes, they're in a sense making a little journey. Close their eyes, they go into the dark. It's up to the witness to make sure that space stays safe and that they are called out afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
So each time we go into an authentic movement process, we're having a little foray into our own underworld. Potentially, we don't always go down in that way. Sometimes we do come up, out or wide, but there is that invitation each time that we have a little dip in, and a little, because we have to do this work gradually, piece by piece.
Exactly.
But the witness is there to keep it safe as possible, to make sure everyone comes out at the end and can return to the everyday consciousness after that journey.
Mm-hmm.
And be present to, obviously, to be a witness to what happened, to help to bring what happened in that movement journey into fuller consciousness so that it can be integrated. So it's like we dive in or we dip in, and we want to bring something back, but through the sharing with the witness, that can become conscious and more fully conscious and integrated. So the witness is really, really important there.
Mm.
And in the Anana story, the witness is a Ninchibur, who is Inanna, the goddess's maid, servant, this wonderful word. She's there to serve Inanna. So she is the witness. She fulfills that function and makes sure that Inanna can return afterwards. It's such a beautiful analogy for what we do in our somatic and authentic movement practices.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I need to read that myth.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's a very gradual and a challenging process to descend into the underworld, and even to descend in the body, in these lower regions of the pelvis and the legs, and a lot of things are hidden here, and we really have to be ready in a way also to contain it.
Yeah.
In gentleness, I think it's an important aspect, not being caught up in the idea, oh, I'm gonna dive in and do everything, make it perfect now. But it's a process which maybe will last all our life.
Probably. And I think, in the days when experiential therapies and body therapies and body psychotherapy were evolving back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was all about catharsis, scream it out.
Yeah.
Now there's much more awareness that is, very occasionally that might be, really what's needed. But in general, we need a much more modulated approach, a little bit at a time, and then integrate it a little bit more, and then we integrate it. And going back to what we started talking about, I think that the listening is much more about listening and sensing and feeling the subtleties. How does this live in my body? How does it move in my body? Getting to know it rather than throwing it out. If I just get rid of this, I'll be okay. We don't actually. We might feel good for a little while to get something out. And sometimes we need to do that. But ultimately, we need to get to know it, and then we can, whatever. There's always a a gem behind. There's something of value within there. There's something that needs to be acknowledged, that needs to find its rightful place within our body and our psyche.
Integration.
Yeah. So we'll throw that out if we, and I think people began to find just, regularly cathartic wasn't actually helping
Right.
to heal.
So you talk about embodied myth, and now you mentioned the myth of Inanna. What would be an embodied myth?
I think I just mean what I was saying there. Inanna is, for me, the best example. We embody this myth as we go through those inner journeys, those inner healing journeys into what we might call the underworld journey. But we go through it because it is a very embodied experience, whether you're practicing authentic movement, somatic movement, where it's very clear because you're tracking what's happening in your body and where you go into those dark places, where you go into the light, you're tracking it in your body. So it's a more consciously embodied process. But even if you're not, you go into, say, a depression, it's a very bodily experience as well as an emotional, psychological experience. But you're going into the underworld. The signs of, say, depression is a very common indicator, something, not just feeling a bit off for a few days, but, if you're really going into something like a depression, that your energy's gone underground. So there's tiredness, there's lethargy, there's inertia. There's bodily states that accompany the emotional state. So it is embodied, whether we're doing that consciously or not. Very often it's not conscious, but if we can be conscious of, oh, okay, I'm in a process, or like you mentioned, the alchemy, I'm in an alchemical process. I'm on a journey through the underworld to meet myself more fully, whatever that might be. For me, that gives a level of holding that can help us through those times. And I feel we need that in the world right now to see we are collectively in an enormous transition time. If we can see that, maybe it helps us to bear.
Right.
We might not be able to change, but to bear what's going on in many parts of the world at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's again related to what you were saying earlier about this intention. We are in a certain process and it doesn't feel comfortable. It changes drastically if we give it this intention. Okay, it is a process. It is my own journey into the underworld. Again, it's this widening then happens of the container.
Yeah. And the sense that, okay, this is a journey that no one knows. No one's been on my journey. No one knows my journey, but people have been on a similar, there's a pattern. Others have been there before me. There's a pattern. So that can give some sense of hope, or, the potential for hope. Maybe I will also get through. Others got through before me. This, the archetype at the moment that I feel, and many people I hear talking about this, is the birth. We're coming out of the underworld. We're in the birth passage. So it's tough. It's fraught and it's risky.
Yeah.
There is risk. There's not a guarantee. But if we can see that and hold that more consciously, all that's going on at the moment for many people in their personal lives, but certainly for us collectively, we're being pushed and squeezed and might feel painful, but maybe we can get through. New life.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think the birth process is one of the aspects of, the underworld journey. For many people, it can be a rebirthing, it can be around resolving a traumatic birth experience. It can be felt to be part of it. So I think they're very connected.
Yeah. A birthing experience and also a dying experience.
Exactly. Something dies. Yeah.
Yeah. Something dies and new parts of us are being born. And
I was on a webinar with someone earlier in the year who was talking about how we are both midwifing a new era, but we're also grieving the old one. And I found that so helpful, because we're leaving a lot of it's been really bad, but a lot of it's been amazingly good, in our own lives as well as collectively and culturally. So things are changing very fast at the moment. So if we can be conscious enough to support this collective midwifing of something new, at the same time as grieving, midwifing the death of the old, the spiritual midwifing. So, gosh, what a challenging time. I feel it's kind of amazing to be part of this. We are in an amazing time, but we don't yet know what the outcome will be.
Yeah. And I feel in this process we are also redefining our own relationship to birth and dying. Something I noticed in my own personal history and my family, and just looking at this relationship of society towards death, where it is still very hidden, or this need to artificially prolong life, really not having this element of midwifing the transition.
Yeah.
But kind of like wanting to prevent it or hide it.
Absolutely. Towards the end of my book, I write about accompanying my sister over that threshold when she was dying. And it was the most profound experience. And the phrase spiritual midwifery came to me as I'm being a witness. There's not a lot I could do, but I could be there. And it was so profound. And for me personally, there was a lot of healing that could happen in our relationship. And of course, sad. But the moment of seeing her transition, it's taken so much fear away for me of the transition. I can only describe the look on her face as she finally let go of that connection, as serenity. It was beautiful, beauty. It was incredibly reassuring. I think if more of us could have that opportunity, it would help us to be less fearful and more willing to speak about it. And as you say, to stop this often unnecessary prolonging when supporting the letting go is what's needed. The chaplain in the hospice talked to us about how the body is ready, the mind might be ready, but did he say consciousness? I think he said consciousness or spirit. I can't remember now. Really struggled. The consciousness struggles to let go of the body. Something very pure. Not the consciousness of our active, I think what we've been talking about here, becoming more conscious of. The pure consciousness, the spirit, struggles to let go of the body. And so often it's quite, that very last stage can be very prolonged. And I did witness that. Every breath looked like it would be the last one, and it wasn't. But it was, sad that you come back to your phrase earlier, the beauty and the sadness. Of course, really sad to see her go, and the moment of her transition, it was beauty, definitely beautiful. Yeah. So I think I absolutely agree with you. We need to stop being nurture life, of course, but also be more willing to see that death is part of it, and be aware of when it's time for death, when it's time for the letting go. I think it's in our daily lives too, isn't it? What do I need to let go of?
Yeah.
To make room for what's coming next. I've always felt I just want to have the new thing starting before I let go of the old. And it doesn't work that way. You have to let go of something to make
Exactly.
space for something new to come in.
Beautiful. I mean, that's a beautiful lesson to embody. And we have our all life to
Learning is
practice, right? Because whole life is a series of that letting go and building something new, and it's a flow. It's a flow of fluids,
absolutely, yeah.
the fluid nature of being.
Yes. And there's something in the Taoist teaching about change. Let me see if I can remember it. Oh, I can't remember. It's something about it's the stopping. It's not the cycling of gaining and losing, or coming and going, or whatever it is they're talking about. The rising and the falling that is the loss, that is the problem. It's the stopping, when we stop that cycle. So they had a way of talking about that. It's when we stop the cycling, or try to stop the cycling. And I think a lot of what you're saying about the artificial prolonging of a life that's ready to end is part of that, because that person's spirit might be really ready to move on. And I think if you have a belief that there is something beyond the physical death, then it is easier,
Definitely.
perhaps easier than if you think that's it. And of course, some people do. So yeah, I've got to be aware of that. For some people, that's really hard, because that's absolutely the end. I don't feel that, but some do.
Yeah.
No, I will say, during that week when I was, sleeping, waking, breathing with my sister, I just felt how much all my somatic and authentic movement practices had absolutely prepared me for that practice of being alongside someone as they were dying. Really, absolutely, totally, all of my practices were there.
Yeah, I have a similar experience when witnessing my mother 2 years ago. And I just remember this scene when she was lying down and couldn't move anymore, and I was in the room and just witnessing, and this feeling of not being able to do really anything but just be a witness. And I remember just sitting there in the room with her, how something energetically was happening at the same time. And I was aware of our personalities and all our history, and just like two people who are in pain at the moment, because she's in pain and I'm in pain for witnessing that. But at the same time, I felt this huge widening and being aware of two souls who are here together. And between these two souls, there is only love. And even though it's pain on this plane, from the soul level, it's only love. And being in that state for a couple of minutes, it healed a lot.
Yeah.
Even though we haven't spoken about things left unspoken, but they were healed on the meta level. And that's such a powerful experience.
Beautiful. Yeah, really beautiful. I had something similar with my mother when she was dying, and yes, it just cuts through all of the. Of course, with our mothers, there's all kinds of personal stuff. They're the root of all our personal stuff. But yeah, those moments that just cut through that, and you come to essence, your essence and their essence. They are really beautiful. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a blessing, really. A blessing. You wrote also one fictional novel, right? The Broken Line.
Two, actually. And the other one's not yet published, but that's my next task.
Okay. Which one is the new one?
It's called Angel's Wing.
Okay. Can you speak a little bit about both of them?
Oh, it was writing fiction was a little bit of a love affair.
Uh-huh.
And I would do at the end of my day of work, and I couldn't wait to get back to it. There was something just so enjoyable about. I had a little kind of interlude from the nonfiction writing, and I love that too, but in a really different way. The fiction, well, both of them. The second one is what's called a pre-sequel to the first one. So it tells the story of a character in the first one who was a bit of a shadowy figure, but absolutely central. So in the second one, I tell her story. And that story is kind of inspired by, on one hand, by my mother's experience in the Second World War as a young, well, a teenager by then, 12, 13, being evacuated. And so it's a story about these four young people who are thrown together during the Second World War. That's essentially where that's located. And the first one, the whole two together, they came out of, in part, I have this mystery in my maternal lineage. My mother knew nothing about her own grandmother and where she came from, what her name was, except that she thought she came from Northern Ireland. And I'd always just thought this was so sad. But this is my broken lineage, that I didn't know where my women ancestors came from and who they were. So it was a great amount of fun doing this. And I think it helped my writing, because actually writing a novel is harder than writing nonfiction.
And your last book is called Embodied Spirit, Conscious Earth?
Yes.
So what does embodied spirit mean for you?
I think it comes out of my lifetime of embodied spiritual practices, such as, it was Tai Chi in the earlier days. I've done yoga, but I did a lot more Tai Chi than yoga. And having little moments of experience where I'd little dropping into moments where I've finally integrated all the details of the form, and I'm absolutely in the flow, and that widening you speak about, I'm absolutely in the flow, and heaven and earth and the horizon, and so there's the little moments that I think I first had through the Tai Chi practice, which I was very deeply involved with for a period, that comes through the attention to the details of the physicality. So it really is, it was different from sitting on my meditation cushion, where I could easily go off, constantly coming back. And of course, it depends how because there are embodied ways of meditating, which later on I started to learn too. But then through the authentic movement practice, looking at this integration of this immanent spirituality coming to just what we were talking about at the beginning, coming through the attention to the body and the embodied experience, the sensations, the feelings, the movements, the gestures, the stillness, the contact sometimes with the space, with other movers, bringing all the attention to those details. And sometimes I think I would see it as when we open out from attention to lots of details, to suddenly there's an experience of the whole.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's how I'd put it. In body mind centering terms, I would think perhaps working with cellular breathing, where we might begin with an image of one cell, a group of cells, and then at some point we are able to embrace in our awareness the whole cellular body. So it's something like that, opening from consciousness of details to a conscious awareness of the whole, that allows our consciousness to potentially open wider.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
I think I would say at the beginning, because I go back 50 years now, when I first started somatic dance and then body mind centering, I felt my two worlds of somatic movement and spiritual practice felt quite separate out there in the world. And over the years, and well, not in me, I think, as you're describing, the somatic work can very much bring us to this wider embrace, this opening to something we might call spiritual. So that interests me a lot, because it's very much been my journey in a way of bringing these two threads together, from the personal, the relational, the collective, and more embracing the what we can call spiritual aspect, so that they're not they don't need to stay separate, intimately interwoven. Yeah. So something like that. Yeah. And coming, and I in the first section of the book, I look at the three practices that have been primary in, and the three teachers been primary in my somatic and embodied awareness journey. And I don't talk about the Tai Chi, that was also important, but I wanted to stay in the somatic authentic movement world. Release work, body mind centering, and the discipline of authentic movement, and how the connection, the differences, but very much the connections that run throughout each, that the invitations they each offer to come into a place first of body mind integration, but then how that can open us into embodiment of spirit and embodied spirituality.
Beautiful. Last question. On your website, you mentioned that you often hold the question, what more am I called to offer as I embrace my elderhood? Do you feel that in today's society we have lost somewhat this role of the elder as the carrier of wisdom?
Yeah. I do think more widely in our mainstream society, we have lost that. Within my smaller community, my students and so on, and colleagues, I feel a lot of respect, and I think my students continue to come. I don't really teach much. I'm just there and, holding and facilitating and witnessing. And they seem to still value that. And I think there is something about the years of experience that people value. So within my sphere of practice, I feel there's a respect for the gifts of having been at this for a while. In the wider society, not. I think certainly here in the UK, it feels like a very ageist society. And I feel that that gets worse and worse. And I think the practical things like we're not very good with technology, and technology is just running away and leaving us behind, things like this. And because ageism, it's like the last ism to be really given a space. And I think it's partly because of that, once you're kind of in your 70s, 80s, 90s, you don't want to be spending your time on social media. You don't know how to do online campaigns. You're not going to be very much out on the street with your banners. So, the elders in our community become a little bit invisible. They create their own communities. I live in this village, and a lot of the villagers who are elders, and they get together, they do things together, and that's great. They support each other. But in the wider community, they're seen as, people who are going to need more healthcare, or, they're just useful for looking after their grandchildren, or whatever it might be.
Right.
There's definitely a loss of a genuine place for the in culture. And families, it'll obviously vary from family to family. Some families will very much value their elders, and others may not. So, yeah. It's sad. Maybe that will change. I don't know. And we need to get better at the social media and the campaigns, and make ourselves better heard.
Yeah, maybe it's just a part of this whole birthing process where everything really needs to be redefined.
Yes. Yeah.
Because in my experience, everything that the mainstream culture has fed to us needs redefining, needs fine-tuning.
Yeah.
So it's just a global process of change, which I feel it's maybe so intense and so painful, because so many things that we took for granted, we need to leave them behind.
Yes. Yeah.
Change our ways completely in this building of the new earth.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the hope and the prayer.
Yeah.
But yes, definitely a lot of letting go. And I'm just going to say accountability seems to be part of it. I do feel we are in an age of accountability. It's not always perfect, but more and more powerful individuals are being called up, or being brought, not always all the way to justice, but there are movements. There's Me Too, there's Black Lives Matter, there's all kinds of movements for the voice of the earth, and there's lots of examples. Politicians being charged with their crimes. So accountability is part of it.
Right.
And perhaps we all need to take that on board, and what can we each be accountable for in our own lives. I don't mean that in a sort of punishing way, but responsibility, maybe that's better. Yeah.
Part of becoming more conscious, not doing things mechanically, but becoming aware.
Yeah. Yeah. And that doesn't mean we'll get things right or perfect all the time, but the awareness is important, I think.
Linda, thank you for a very inspiring conversation.
Been an absolute pleasure. Yeah.
Your voice and all the ideas, and thank you for all the work you do and you have done.
Well, thank you for guiding this conversation. It's not what I was expecting, but it's been really enjoyable and interesting, and can meet in this way.
What did you expect?
All talking about somatic movement and
Ah, no.
what did I learn? It's not interesting to anyone, though. Yeah, no, this has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.